Welcome back to Mommy Meltdown on Giant TV. I'm Stephanie Mizzi. Coming up on May the 7th is Youth Mental Health Day, and mental health is something that my family and I are really familiar with, and it's actually what led me to do Mommy Meltdown. So much of what we go through on a day-to-day basis makes me have my own meltdowns quite often. And, you know, navigating the system to find help for your child is daunting and confusing, and quite honestly can be a scary time as well, which is why I thought, let's bring this to the forefront. Let's talk about this today as we celebrate Youth Mental Health Day coming up this week. And to help me do that today are Sarah Cannon, Executive Director of Parents of Children's Mental Health, and Fred Steinhaus, Resource Coordinator with Contact Niagara. Thank you guys so very much for coming in and talking about something that is quite near and dear to my heart and obviously to yours as well. Let's start off right at the beginning, actually. One of the big items I think that parents struggle with is to know what's a typical age-related behavior and when is it a little more on the other side of the spectrum, if you will, and dabbles into the mental health sort of things. Can you answer that, Fred?
It's a really, really difficult question to ask. What's normal, what's not normal? And I know in parenting my own teenagers, we often face that quandary. But I suspect that if it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, then it's something that's worth investigating.
Yes. And I found too, at least with my own child, that if other people are starting to notice and ask questions, you know, like you start to get notes.
And schools notice as well.
Yes,
right?
They do. Yeah.
For sure.
Although it's the one thing that I found, and I don't know if you found this, Sarah, that schools were a little more reluctant to indicate that there might be something more going on. And it was actually a question that I posed to my children's administrators and principals and said, like, you know, I'm surprised nobody came to me earlier with suspicions. I mean, it was something I always suspected from a very early age. Like when James was diagnosed with ADHD at 6, I had known for 4 years prior that we were probably dealing with something more than that. But the schools actually said to me, you know, we don't like to give our suspicions, or we're not doctors, actually, is the word that they used, you know.
Because what they don't want to do is they don't want to come out and say, well, we think your kid has ADHD. Because they're right, they're not medical doctors, right?
So I think, too, in schools, they're reluctant to place labels on kids a lot of times because of the stigma, too, right? So, and they don't know how parents are going to react. I always tell parents, and it's kind of like what you said, Fred, if you're feeling uncomfortable, but families and parents are the experts in their children. If your gut is telling you something's going on, whether it's physical or mental, chances are you're right. And it at least bears exploration, but the stigma can be really scary to go out and do that.
And
the nice thing is that there's lots of places you can go to find some answers to help you along that route.
So tell me that first step, actually, you know, maybe go into your doctor. I guess that's really the first step. You go to your family doctor, your pediatrician, and you ask, you know, you tell them what's going on, and then they kind of take it from there. From that step, you get the diagnosis that your child has ADHD or autism or whatever. What is the first step?
Well, what often happens, first of all, I'll tell you about Contact Niagara. So Contact Niagara is what's called an access center for services in the Niagara region that are funded through the Ministry of Child, Community, and Social Services.
Okay.
And there's about 15 agencies across Niagara that are funded by the government, and we act as the screening and intake department for all of them. Okay. So whenever there's issues regarding child and adolescent mental health, children's psychiatric services, autism services, developmental services, all of those referrals get forwarded to Contact Niagara. Okay. We complete the referrals and make sure that it gets forwarded to the most appropriate agency. Okay. So doctors often know, and schools know, and other professionals know, the Contact Niagara is really the first step in where to go, because then we're going to direct you to the most appropriate place. So one of the things we like to say is that Contact Niagara is never the wrong place to call.
It's so true. That was my experience as well, that, you know, you are the very first step. And I loved that you knew where to put us and the people to put us in contact with.
Yeah, for sure.
Know, I thought
and so there's lots of choices that can be made, but not only services that are funded through our ministry, but there's all sorts of other programs that are available across Niagara that we also inform people about.
And there's so many services that even myself, I've been engrossed in this for 5 years now, that even now, there's services that I'm going, I had no idea. I didn't even realize that was available. Sure. So,
I mean, for a child who's ADHD, we often refer them over to the Learning Disabilities Association.
That's right.
Or to the Helping Others Parent Effectively program, which is a parent support and education program for parents who have kids with ADD or ADHD. Really is a great organization.
And it's a great support group. The Hope group is fantastic. That's a group that we've used in the past as well. And it is nice. It's nice to sit down and talk with parents who kind of, get it. They know where you're coming from.
Sure do.
Because parenting kids with special needs is a whole other ball game.
Yeah. Only those who go through it they get it.
Truly.
And I think that is one of the things that families really do need to keep in mind if they're starting out this journey is that it can feel really isolating and you feel like you're really alone and you're constantly questioning like which part of this was my fault and I'm not doing a very good job. And when you start to access support groups or you start to learn a little bit more, you feel a little bit more confident that, oh my goodness, I'm not the only one. I remember one of the support groups that I ran in Niagara, and a mom came in and she was just so upset because they'd had an issue with their child and they had ended up removing the child's bedroom door.
Oh, yes.
And they were constantly questioning like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we've done this. And every single person at that table had a story about the bedroom door. Like, and the sheer, we had no idea what to do, the hopelessness, and just normalizing that a little bit. It made all of us feel a little bit like we're not doing this alone, and we are all just doing the very best we can with the tools that we have. And you have to give yourself some grace.
Absolutely. And forgiveness sometimes too. Right?
Absolutely. Yes. I'm so glad that you said that, Fred, because it's so easy as any parent, let alone if you're parenting a child who's, a little more difficult at times, you do blame yourself.
All the time.
A lot.
Always. And there's a lot of other people too who also
blame you.
Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes
they do.
I don't want to say for other professionals, but it happens quite often. You hear it from parents, like I feel singled out and I feel blamed and I feel ashamed.
And we become a bit hypersensitive to it, I think, because we're feeling so much of it ourselves that if there's even the slightest suggestion, we can get really, I know I've had some struggles that myself, and I get really like my ears prick right up like, oh yeah, this is not my fault. This is not my fault.
Exactly.
And I don't know who I'm trying to convince, me or the other folks.
Oh, we were mentioning a little bit off the top there about the stigma around parents talking and getting help for their children. Do you think that because there is still a stigma, we're fighting it, and there's lots of open talk about it, and thank God for that. But there still is a stigma attached to getting that diagnosis for your child. Do you think that holds parents up sometimes from taking those first steps?
I think it holds parents up sometimes because they're scared of what they're going to find out, possibly what it could potentially mean about themselves as parents. But we're really surrounded by an awful lot of information that's talking now about mental health. And I think the word really is getting up, because I know from our perspective at Contact Niagara, our business has really increased 10% a year over the last 10 years.
Wow,
so that's a 100% increase in business. And that's because the word is getting out. People are hearing more, and schools are more familiar with it. So things are getting better, but it's still really, really difficult.
It's still very, very difficult.
I know as a family member, I mean, we say that we're getting better at stigma, and I do, like, thank goodness we're talking about it. There's things like this on now that weren't 15, 16 years ago when my daughter was first diagnosed. I think that we have to be cautious that we don't become, that we don't replace becoming politically correct with eliminating stigma. So now people are just more aware of what they can't say, but it isn't necessarily that they aren't feeling it. And I think that it's been so pervasive for such a long time that there's an inherent sort of belief that people have about mental illness and crazy and the perceptions of that, as well as families being part of the problem. I think that's the biggest thing for me is that immediately there's these assessments about the parenting, and you are constantly feeling like you have to prove I am not a perfect parent, but I don't think that my flaws as a parent have done this.
That's right.
And just feeling questioned and being under a microscope, and it it's hard to sort of, I think, sometimes stay in the game. So even if you're not scared to access the help, once you do get the help and you feel like you're being put under a microscope, it's very difficult. And I don't know any family, whether their kid has mental illness or not, that if you put them under that kind of a microscope, you're going to be able to pick up things that, aren't out of the Parenting 101 guidebook. If there is one, I'd like to know where it's published.
That's for sure.
So it's very scary. And again, I think that's where some peer support comes into play, because people that haven't been under those microscopes, they don't understand those microscopes. There's always a fear, and not necessarily founded, but there's this looming fear over families that, the government wants to come in and we're going to be all reported to, Family and Children's Services, which is so not true, but it's a fear for families.
For sure.
Number one, we're watching our kids struggle, and we just want to do what's best for them, and we don't like feeling inept or helpless for them. So, But I think stigma that's a big one. That's a big
battle,
for sure.
Right? Yeah.
And I also think, too, this was something that we struggled with when it comes to the stigma. And we mentioned this, Sarah, at the top, you were mentioning about labels. And I distinctly remember my sister actually saying, you don't want him to have that label in school. And I said, it's a diagnosis. It's not a label. It's a diagnosis, And I think that's something that we still struggle with. We're very, very open about both of our sons and their mental health struggles with coaches, with family, with friends, because I personally think that it helps people to understand them better. But there is a fine line, and sometimes I think I fall off that line. So I'm wondering your feedback on that. Do you think that parents should share their children's mental health struggles with, like, say, family and friends and coaches?
I think that the short answer is yes. Any information that you can give, regardless of whether or not your child has a diagnosis or not, right? Any information that you can give the people, and especially the adult allies in their life, that can help. I think that when we start to talk more publicly, then that's always good, and we should always be willing to, because I think that helps us eliminate our own self-shame and self-stigma. But at the same time, I think just to remind families to be respectful of, it isn't just your story, right? It's your child's story. And as they get older, it can be challenging for them too. So, in our world of social media and high school and the way sometimes kids can be, I think it's just really important to keep those lines of communication open in the home too. So, and if, your child is saying to you, but I don't want my coach to know this.
Yes.
So instead of just telling everything, it creates conversations too, where you can say, okay, well, what pieces do you want your coach to know? What do you think would be helpful for your coach? So instead of it just being no, don't tell anybody anything, say, okay, well, which pieces are you okay with me sharing?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing, and not so unfortunate though, is that the child in some instances does need to have that diagnosis,
right?
Because it assists in a lot of different areas. It can provide additional supports within the school system.
Absolutely.
So it can be very, very. It's one of the requirements to get any sort of financial handicap benefits is to have that diagnosis, right?
Which really, you don't realize how much those benefits actually do help
absolutely.
you. It's amazing.
I don't think people realize the financial burden.
Just the special needs child. For sure.
Yeah. And, just the amount of time that it takes. Most of the families that we support at my organization, I would say that they have all had to make very conscious decisions about potentially being a one-income family, because one of the parents has had to leave their job or decrease their hours, because it becomes a full-time job.
Absolutely.
Because it's so hard a lot of these kids aren't even able to go to school for a full day. Or
not be in daycare or childcare.
Yeah, I've had my daughter was politely removed from many a daycare situation.
I like that. Yeah, I always like to refer to it as politely as well. That's all good.
Yeah, her expulsions started at 3.
Oh, I feel so much better. Actually, I really do feel much better. together.
Yeah, those are those proud mommy moments,
Right,
where you
yes.
walk behind your kid like, yeah, that's my kid.
The proud mommy moment comes, and afterwards the mommy meltdown cues in, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. Yeah, no, we've got Sarah Cannon, I should say, with his Executive Director of Parents of Children's Mental Health, and Fred Steinhaus, Resource Coordinator with Contact Niagara, joining me on Mommy Meltdown today, talking about youth mental health as we lead up to Youth Mental Health Day. Do you find, Fred, you mentioned that Contact Niagara's intakes, I guess we can say, has increased huge numbers.
Hugely over the past 10 years.
Do you find that do you think that is because we are knowing more? Like, I mean, childhood anxiety and depression just seems to me to be on the rise.
Anxiety is going through the roof.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me.
Right. I think there's a number of reasons for it. I think that the kids really do face an awful lot more social pressures now that we didn't have as kids. We didn't have the social media pressures and all of those things. So I think that's made things more difficult for kids. I also think that we're better able to diagnose and pinpoint specific problems. Because I remember when I went to school, they never called it ADHD. Do you know what they called it back then? Minimal brain dysfunction.
What? Oh my goodness, is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
I know.
Well, we've come leaps and bounds.
We thought, oh, these are little brain damaged children, right?
Unbelievable.
So we've come an awful long way.
We certainly
right?
have, yes.
And, I think we're getting better as we get along. But I do really think that piece is about we're just better able to diagnose and pinpoint problems.
Do you find that the anxiety and depression factor too, like when I think of anxiety and depression, and even, at my age of 45, I think that's something that, 45-year-olds should get, or maybe like in your 20s, you should get that. Not when you're 7 and 6.
I think you got to look at when we were 6 and 7, sort of what pressures we had. We didn't have pressures. Like even in school now, like it is incredible what these little people
have to retain.
And their responsibilities and how they need to conduct themselves. Like there's all kinds of stuff coming at them, and their brains aren't fully developed, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And I also think one of the things is that when we were kids, if we felt sad, if we felt anxious, our mechanisms to deal with it was just to cope.
Yes.
Just to cope. You don't feel good, go make your bed.
Yeah.
Whatever it was.
Go outside.
So we hear stories now of a little girl who's not invited to a party, so her mother invents a party so the girl doesn't feel left out.
Yes.
Right? And so what's happening is that children aren't being allowed to experience the full range of emotions as children.
Yes.
Because we don't suddenly grow up to become adults and say, okay, now I know how to manage my anxiety, and now I know how to manage my anger. No, it's something they have to learn in childhood to be able to successfully do it, right?
Yeah,
so I think we're talking about, what? Sometimes it's okay to let your kid feel sad.
Yes,
Sometimes
you're absolutely
it's okay,
right. I agree with you.
As opposed to trying to, and every parent wants their kid to feel better, and every parent doesn't want their kid to hurt.
Yeah.
And we do it for the right reasons.
Yeah.
But the downside of that is that the kid's not experiencing. They don't know how to deal with it.
Yes.
Yeah. We're forgetting that we have to build resiliency in our children, because that is honestly the best.
That's the best coping mechanism.
That is the best coping mechanism.
There is.
Sure.
And I have found too that because my children were diagnosed early, early on, 6 years old, both of them, that I actually find them to be a little more resilient.
My children, both my children, are incredibly more resilient.
It's interesting, isn't it? Is it because they've had to fight for that?
I think they've had to
stay ahead.
Yeah, they've had to overcome some struggles, and they've also been taught through their treatments, right?
Yes.
Some coping strategies, but they have been, especially my older daughter, she's really struggled socially. She's had to deal with the heartbreak of, that social exile and learning that, I can get up the next day. Like, just because Betty Lou isn't talking to me, it's going to be okay. And I think that we become a little bit more resilient as parents too. And as you go down this journey with your kids, I think we start to become pretty expert at realizing what is illness, like what now are you truly struggling with because you're truly struggling, and now when are you just being an imp because you're 10 and that's what 10-year-olds do.
Yes.
And it isn't something I don't think that people can teach or that I could say to you, hey, if your child's doing this and this, they're just being an imp. You grow up as a parent with your kids, so you become more resilient. you're modeling resilience for them, and you just become this little unit of that. And in a lot of ways, I'll never forget this story. My daughter was asked when she was quite young to list 5 things she really liked about herself and 5 things that she struggled with. And on the column of things that she really liked about herself, she had put her mental illness diagnosis. Okay. And I said, I think she was confused by the exercise. And they said, no, we talked to her about it. And she actually started to list all of the opportunities that this gives her in terms of creativity and the opportunities that she's had, the people that she's met, some of the skills that she's learned. And so I always remember that she's grown up, not seeing this as a negative, but seeing this as something that makes her unique and maybe better equipped than some of the other kids.
Yeah, for sure.
I have to know the tip that you must have then, because honestly, I wish that, especially my 11-year-old, my 9-year-old, I don't think he quite understands his mental health issues. Like, I think he's had a couple of panic attacks now that are related to his anxiety. But I don't think he correlates the both, what's going on with exactly what's going on with it. My 11-year-old is very much, and has always been very much aware of what's going on, but he never tells me he likes it. He says, I hate having ADHD. I hate not being able to do this, that, or the other thing. I love, if you got a tip for me, I would take it.
You know what I think it is? Awesome. I mean, and there's always things that, it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. There's lots of things about me that I really like, but I could flip that coin and talk about why I don't. All of us go through that. Yeah. I think for me, the biggest thing in my house is we have to talk about this. Like, there is an open line of communication. If you're feeling really crappy, but she's also said to me, I've said to her things like, but you're so, like, you're special or you're unique. And she's also, the flip side, said, you know what, Mom? One day I just want to be normal. I don't want to be special. I don't want to be unique. Sure. So as long as you keep those lines of communication open, I think that it has nothing to do with a mental illness diagnosis or not. That's part of human nature.
And good parenting.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, it really
doing
is.
what you got to do sometimes. And and I am always very, very open with my kids about when I mess up. Yeah. Because mommy meltdowns, there are days that I'm like, I have just sunk to, like, I just had a fight with her. Yes. Like, I am a toddler. Like, that we're screaming at each other. But being able to go and say, you know what? I was really struggling with my own stuff, and I'm really, really sorry. That wasn't a very good demonstration of, like, how I should have behaved. So I think that has just sort of allowed them the space to make mistakes and talk about their mistakes as well. I think communication is just key.
And I don't know if your own girls do this, but when I do that, my boys are way more forgiving of me than I am.
For sure.
Their meltdowns, I'm like, not acceptable. And like, I have my own, they're like, that's okay, Mom. I'm thinking, okay, thank you.
Or sometimes they don't even notice.
Yes, absolutely.
They are so smart, and they pick up on more. And I think that's part of why conversations like this are so important, and families supporting other families and being strong, because even though if we're putting on a face, they know when we're in our bedroom crying at night, we're in this journey together, and we got a model for them.
Absolutely. So, and and finding that person that you can talk to and feel safe.
Yeah.
Just want to talk about Pathstone for a second.
Yes.
And I'd like to share the Pathstone website, which is www.pathstonementalhealth.ca.
Yes.
And I know that people struggle with questions about, is this a problem, is this not a problem, or something does develop, and how do I manage it? Well, Pathstone's got some really wonderful programs you can find on the Pathstone website.
They do.
They do have a walk-in counseling clinic that's available.
They do, which is fantastic. Oh, it's fantastic.
You can bring your kids in, but not only that, parents can go in by themselves.
They can,
and say, do you know what? I'm just struggling with this. I'm not sure how to manage it.
Yep.
They have some great parenting programs.
Yes.
They've got one called Surviving the Teenage Years, which is wonderful.
They do have that one.
And I teach the 1, 2, 3 Magic program. That's the kids.
Excellent.
The kids 2 to 12. I think they've been doing that now for 20 years.
Do you know what I used to say to my 1, 2, 3 Magic instructor? I used to say, there is nothing magical about 1, 2, 3. I can count to 100.
I do remember 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
And they do have the crisis service that's available 24 hours a day.
Yes, and really we have used that on a number of occasions when things were very bad. And I can tell you, it's a lifesaver.
About that crisis line too, I know from our experience with families, sometimes they're really reticent to call that line, and they think, well, my kid's not.
Is this a crisis? Is it not? Yes.
But do you know why else it's really important? Because they keep track of those calls. Absolutely. And so if things, you can start to see if things are starting to escalate. So when you're in service or about to be in service, that really helps inform the treatment that you can get.
It really does.
That's what boosted us.
Yeah, don't be scared to access any of the services. Absolutely. And you know what? What's the big deal if you call and you spend 5 minutes realizing I didn't need to call? So what?
Be thankful.
Exactly.
Be thankful if you called and you didn't need it.
Every time you call, that information gets into your child's record at the agency, which in and of itself is very important.
Well, it was big. It was big for us. I called 3 times, almost back to back, probably within like a month and a half. Yeah. And honestly, it's what boosted our ability to be able to get into Bathstone, fast tracked. I mean, I don't even know if you can say that, but it certainly felt that way, for sure. We have got Fred Steinhaus here, resource coordinator with Contact to Niagara, and Sarah Cannon, executive director of Parents of Children's Mental Health. Before we wrap things up here, I do want to actually talk a little bit about Parents of Children's Mental Health. We talked about how important it is to have a support system, and not everybody has the luxury of having a family around or family who understand what they're going through. And I have to tell you, Sarah, this is so important to me. And I only recently discovered you, and I'm so glad I did.
Yeah.
Because when you're going through this, you feel very alone.
You do.
So tell me about your organization, how you help us.
So our organization is a provincial, so we're Ontario based, and we have chapters across the province. And all of our chapters are run by family members, so parents of children who have mental health disorders, and we are not diagnosis specific, right? So, and we say we're parents of children's mental health, and most of the families that come to our groups are young, but we also have families that are coming, their kids are 20, or because when you're a parent, like my oldest is almost 23, she's still my baby, right?
Well,
like she's still my kid,
ends, right? It doesn't end. Yeah.
So we don't necessarily have an age limit. We are a little bit more knowledgeable about navigating child and youth mental health services than adult services, but we also we help families. We get lots of calls for families like you saying, oh my gosh, I think this is going on. Where do I go? What do I do? And so our chapter leaders will help navigate families to that. They'll help talk to them about what's going on in school, but most importantly, they link them to a network of families who are all feeling the same way. And so that's the main thrust of what our organization does. We also work with child and youth mental health agencies in helping to build partnerships with families.
Yes.
So how do we see our system being built with families? So if a system is going to work for the people it's built for, we should probably get the input of the people who are accessing it.
Absolutely.
So we do a lot of work with community-based mental health organizations and helping to build those partnerships with families and increase the relationships and shifting the needle from, our services, our mental health community services were built decades ago on the premise that families were part of the problem. And we're all of us working together to shift that paradigm into families are part of the solution and really empower families. I think empower them to have a voice in sort of the larger cause, but empower them, as we were talking about, give yourself some grace. Be able to forgive yourself. Remember that this is not your fault. You're not in it alone. Just look at the stats. And just being there for one another, because it is a very, very unique challenge.
It is.
Parenting is challenging enough.
Period.
Oh.
Yes.
In my workshop, I say, parenting is the toughest thing you're ever going to do.
It is.
Yeah.
If you want easy, get a hamster. It's true, though.
It is so true.
Damn, too late now.
But I want to talk about Sarah too, because Sarah does an awful lot of work with a lot of the agencies around in terms of family inclusion, and she does training for agencies to assist agencies become more family friendly, and also to have families more included in the running of organizations.
Oh, I
so
love
she's
that.
been doing that training for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And it's awesome.
That is awesome.
It is.
Yeah, because you don't realize that, it's a whole unit, as you say. And
yeah, it
you don't,
never
a lot of
affects
parents
just one
don't
person.
even realize that they're really, you have, even if you don't want the role, you are now an advocate.
That's exactly right.
You are an advocate, whether you want to be there or not. You better learn how to advocate.
Because
right?
if you don't do it for your kid, who's going to do it?
Well, that's exactly it. But that can be a slippery and scary slope to go on. So I just love that you guys help with that.
It's very, very scary being an advocate, because sometimes, like, if you've ever been to a school meeting where you've got like 12 staff and then and it's like, so that's some of the empowerment, like, really figuring that place out, and also giving yourself permission to be an advocate, because we are in Ontario, and we are very polite, and people don't like to make waves, and I don't want to make any trouble. We have to look at it as we're not making trouble, and that shouldn't be the approach you take. You shouldn't go into school, sort of
irritating,
not that I have.
blazing.
I look at Fred, because Fred and I have had some where I've gone in blazing, but it's hard. Families where your emotions are so charged because this is your child, you're feeling desperate. So how can all of us support each other to have our voices heard, even through all of that emotion?
And have the best outcome for the kids. At the end of the day, that's what we want.
And I think that's what we as families and system need to keep in mind. Every single person in this system, whether it's family, a service, a social service worker, anybody in the family, we really do all have the children and youth at the center of our focus. So
one last thing. What are your hopes for the future of youth mental health?
Well, I have a lot of hopes.
That's great. I'm glad to hear that.
I'm hoping that we can develop a fully comprehensive system of children's mental health services across all age ranges.
Yes.
That are working together, that are working from a systems perspective, not from each individual agency, but rather looking at everything as a community.
Right.
So how can an agency work within a community to assist others?
Right.
That's
I love that.
That's what I like to see.
Excellent. Sarah?
What is my hope? I don't know. I think that I agree with Fred, and I think that, I want my hope to be that one day we get to the point where as families we navigate and talk about mental illness and know inherently how to help our kid, just as we would if our kid fell off the slide at the playground and broke their wrist.
Yes.
That it would not be, that this is not a big, I hope my kids grow up thinking, wow, like you guys had to actually like advocate for mental health services. You had to, there was a whole system.
You went to how many parenting classes?
Exactly.
So we're talking about mental health carries no more stigma than saying, my kid has a cold.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, yes,
but not as prevalent as colds.
Must be.
We don't want that to come up every, month or so. Yeah. Oh, it's been great. Thank you so much, guys. We've had Sarah Cannon, Executive Director of Parents of Children's Mental Health, and Fred Steinhaus, Resource Coordinator with Contact Niagara, joining us today. Can you just give us your website so people can quickly find you?
Absolutely. We're at www.contactniagara.org.
Excellent.
And we are www.pcmh.ca.
Once again, guys, thank you so much for joining me today on Mommy Meltdown. And thank you for joining me today on Mommy Meltdown. And as well, remember, you can freak out, you just can't stress out because you had a Mommy Meltdown. We'll see you next time.